You're listening to the Comic Crusaders podcast. I am your host, Al Mega, CEO of Comic Crusaders and Undercover Capes. In this show, I'm sitting down with creators from all walks of life to talk about inspiration, process, the lessons they've learned, and a whole lot more. Wepa Crusaders, welcome back to another epic episode of the Comic Crusaders podcast. I'm your boy, Al Mega, and today we've got a guest whose name is synonymous with gripping, edge of your seat, page-turning thrillers. He's a New York Times and international best-selling author, the mastermind behind some of the most terrifying and suspenseful stories out there. You've seen his work across bookshelves, and soon you'll be seeing his stories hit the big screen. From collaborating with literary giant James Patterson to having his books adapted into film and TV, this man knows the ins and outs of publishing world like no other. Today, we're diving deep into his creative process, his Hollywood ventures, and what it takes to build a successful writing career. Crusaders, give it up for the one, the only, the man with the mightiest pen in the business.
How you doing, man? I'm gonna have you follow me around every place I go and just introduce me like that when I walk into the room. That was perfect.
Thank you. People love those intros, man. It's because again, when I looked into what you've been doing in your journey, and even how you got started with whom, I was like, holy smokes, man! Very interesting stuff going on here, JD. So again, just thank you for taking time out of that schedule of yours. I know you are an award-winning author. You must be busy getting some work done. But for those that are unaware, and how dare they not be aware of who JD is over here, all right? Let us know a little bit, OG, where you're from, and what was the first thing in all of fandom that you ever fell in love with?
Oh, wow. So this dates back. So I grew up without a TV in the house. And this was the 70s, so that's not saying a whole lot. We only had 3 channels anyway, so there wasn't anything worth watching. But we hit the library a lot. And I was reading by a really early age. When I was 3, I started all the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew mysteries and finished those before kindergarten. Moved on to the classics. My mom owned an antique store, and we used to hit yard sales and garage sales and estate sales all the time. And I remember going to one with her, and there was a box of books sitting next to this table, and Dracula was sitting up on the top. It was 25 cents for a paperback. And I had read, like Dickens and stuff like that prior to that. I was 8 years old, I think, when I found this. The cover looked scary as hell. And I was like, I really want to get that. There's no way my mom's going to let me buy it. It was 25 cents. She let me buy it. I took it home, and I read that whole book in like maybe 2 or 3 days. And I had to keep my lights on for like a good 2 weeks after that. It scared the bejesus out of me. And I think that's what honestly made me want to become a writer. Like the fact that I could open up a book and get lost in this world that somebody created. And get that kind of an emotional response out of somebody like me. Like I have just been chasing that ever since.
Wonderful. Now, so from self-publishing to working with major publishers, right? What was the turning point that you think got you noticed by the big leagues, if you will?
Well, I've had a crazy path. So my very first book, it was called Forsaken. And I indie published that, but I had a huge leg up because Stephen King read it before it came out, and he let me use some of his characters in the book.
Stephen King, wait a minute, reel it back. Stephen King, how you get involved in all this mess? How you met him?
So I'm one of those guys where, it's unless somebody tells me no, I just kind of keep chasing things. So in the book, I had to explain where the wife buys a journal. And just to get the story down on paper, I wrote that she walked into Needful Things, the store from Stephen King's story, and fully expected to have to change that because you can't do that sort of thing without a bunch of lawyers knocking on your door. Yeah. But my wife read it and she said, no, you know what? I like this. Let's see if we can get his permission to use it. It turns out he's got a house in Florida that's about 10 minutes from my mom's house. So we printed out the book. We hopped in the car and we figured, well, we'll head over to Steve's house. He'll be outside gardening. I'll hand him a manuscript. He'll give me a big thumbs up and we'll be on our way. It didn't work out that way. He lives on an island off the coast called Casey Key. And if you go over this tiny little bridge, and if you make a left, you go to like where all the bars and restaurants and hotels and stuff are. If you make a right, you basically hit the entire half of the island that Stephen King owns. There's immediately a private drive sign and no trespassing sign. There was a gate. There was another gate. We got about a half mile down this road, which I guess was his driveway. And I was watching the trees for snipers, thinking this is probably a really bad idea. So we turned around, we went back to a restaurant that we saw. I called a friend of mine who knew King, and he said, yeah, oh, don't stalk Steve. He hates that. Here's his email address. Send him the book. If he likes it, you'll hear back from him. If the book is garbage, he probably won't reply. And I got an email back from King, I guess about 2 or 3 days later. He said, go ahead and use the reference. Let me know if you need anything. I love it. And that was the start of it all. That book went on to sell about 250,000 copies as an indie published title. Mainly because of the Stephen King angle. When the book was first released, everybody publishes indie books. You hit that publish button on Amazon and you kind of hope that something's going to, big is going to happen. But sales were okay, but nothing great. I hired a PR person to come in, and I told her about this, basically a failed trip to Stephen King's house. And she said, you know what, that's the story. So she wrote that up, and that ended up in a national publication. And when that came up, the story about an author's failed trip to Stephen King's house, librarians picked up the book, bookstore owners picked it up, and that's what really ignited it.
Oh, cool.
So that was the very first one. That was indie published, but because I sold so many, that put me on the radar of the traditional guys. So when my second book was ready to go, it was called The Fourth Monkey, about a serial killer in Chicago. I had no trouble getting an agent, no trouble scoring a traditional deal. I ended up selling that one for a little over 7 figures with a film and TV show attached to it. Completely, flipped everything on its head. I did a couple of books through the traditional model, publishing with HarperCollins, with Putnam, Penguin Random House, all the big guys. But I had gotten a taste for being an indie and all the freedom and control that you have. And when you do the traditional route, you lose all of that. You hand off the book, and it's not really your book anymore. They do their own thing with it. So I missed that. So at one point, I wrote a book called A Caller's Game, and I told my agent, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do something different here. I want you to go ahead and sell all the foreign territories. And I'm in about 150 different countries, almost 30 languages. So it's a big market for her. I told her I wanted to publish in English on my own, through my own imprint as an indie. So I did the next couple of books that way, where I basically did a hybrid approach. I published as an indie in some places. We got traditional publishers in other places, and got the book out to as many as we could. I did that for a couple of years. And then with my last book, it was called Behind a Closed Door. We were shopping that, and we got a film deal right away. And the traditional publishers were getting ready to go to auction on it, meaning there were more than one publisher that wanted it.
Oh, wow.
A phone call from a friend of mine at HarperCollins and Random House, and they basically both told me the same thing. We're going to offer on your book. You need to turn it down because we're going to lay off a lot of people. And the editors who want your book, they're on that list. Which is a scary thing if you're an author, because that book can end up in limbo and basically never come out. My last real job, I was a chief compliance officer for a brokerage firm. I worked in finance. Simon & Schuster.
Fun.
It was terrible. I hated that job. Simon & Schuster had just gotten bought by a private equity firm. So I reached out to some people that knew those people, and ultimately started conversations with Simon & Schuster. I ended up creating my own imprint on Simon & Schuster. So I basically have my own publishing house, but Simon & Schuster handles my print sales and distribution. So in today's world, I've got the best of both worlds. I get to act as an indie. I can put out what I want when I want, but through Simon & Schuster, which gets me into places like the grocery stores, airports, and the places you can't get to as an indie. So that's what I'm doing today.
Oh man, you are murdering it, man, for real. So let's talk about those creative synergies, because you've actually worked with some big boys. You mentioned just Stephen allowing you an opportunity, but you've kind of worked with one of the biggest names in publishing, and Mr. James Patterson. What was it like collaborating with him, and how did that partnership even come about?
So that came about when The Fourth Monkey was done. The publisher sent out copies. They do this all the time to all the big name authors, hoping to get that sentence that they can put on the cover. Best book ever, by so and so. Yeah, quote. So they scatter shoot those out. They send them out to a lot of people. James Patterson got a copy of The Fourth Monkey, and he liked it enough to pick up the phone and call me. And we talked about it. And I made plans with them for next time I was in Florida, so we could get together for lunch. And we ended up sitting down and we hashed out some ideas, and ultimately ended up writing a book together called The Coast to Coast Murders. I thought it was going to be a one-off thing. I wasn't sure we were going to do it again, but our fifth book together is called The Writer. It comes out in March. So every time I think me and Jim are done, we come up with some other crazy idea and decide to give it a try.
Oh, great. Talk about creative synergy. I love it. So, let's talk about them balancing those voices, because here you are, you're working with a legend. So when you co-write a book, for example, how do you balance your style with that of your writing partner? You know what I mean? While keeping the story cohesive, if you will.
Yeah, so me and Patterson have very similar writing styles, so it kind of works. He has taught me a lot. Things that I wouldn't have changed in books, like if it were just a solo title, scenes that I would have written. He's gone back and he's edited those, and he'd helped me tweak them and basically taught me how to make them better. So I carry a lot of that with me. I mean, working with him, he's got a masterclass you can take if you take those at masterclass.com, and he will teach you his entire process. And writing a book for him in real life is exactly the same as that, except he actually calls you and tells you everything you're doing wrong. And if that happens enough, like that learning curve is there. When I sit down and I'm writing something, I can hear Jim in the background going, "That sentence is too long." Too
That's like
wordy.
That video. You wrote the sentence, he just pops up behind you like, "Oh shit!"
Yeah. It's like he's standing on my shoulder. You pick up your pacing. You're it's dragging here, but that he's been with me basically every book since.
Oh, that's amazing. But to have a mentor like that, then where you kind of you hear them when so that's actually good. That's powerful. Fantastic.
Yeah. Well, and the thing with Jim too is like most people don't know this, but he came out of marketing. He worked for an advertising agency in New York long before he started writing his own books. He wrote the Toys R Us theme song. If you remember, "I Want to Be a Toys R Us Kid."
Really? No way.
Yeah. So that was him back in the day. So, and he loves the business side of stuff, the marketing side of things. So, when we've got a book coming out together, I have more fun talking to him about the business, like how are we going to promote this book? Because he will come up with some crazy stuff out of left field that nobody is doing. And it works. I mean, that's why this guy hits the New York Times list over and over and over again. So, I love it. As a mentor, he's fantastic.
That's fantastic. Now, let me talk to you about, because you mentioned how some things are in the works, if you will, in development for either film, television. How involved are you in the adaptation process, and how does it feel to see your words, kind of coming to life onto a screen?
Well, I'm an executive producer on each of the projects, which in some cases means that they pick up the phone and then they call me. In other cases, they don't talk to me at all. Hollywood is a machine, and if you hire a director, that director is going to have, a certain cinematographer he's going to want to work with, a certain lighting person, certain writers, it's like, and they work well together. So the last thing they want is some author who lives up in New England telling them what to do. They know what to do. So I'm basically there if they've got questions on the story, like, why did this happen? Does this make sense if we change this part? Can we combine these characters? Those types of changes. That's usually where they get me involved. I've got 8 different projects in what I call various stages of Hollywood hell. At this point, nothing has actually gotten filmed yet. It just keeps getting optioned over and over again. It goes from this studio to this studio. This one's got a writer. This one's got a director. This one loses its writer. This one has a new director. Just constantly in flux. Somebody told me once, if you watch the credits at the end of a movie, all those names going by for 5 or 6 minutes, literally everybody that they mentioned had to be there in order for that movie to get to the screen. You take one of those names away and all of a sudden that project didn't happen. So it gives you a really good understanding of what kind of perfect storm is required to actually get a book to the screen.
Jeez, now you're killing me here, because I was about to ask you which industry is more challenging, navigating the publishing or dealing with Hollywood adaptation process.
It's a little bit of both. It's funny, when the strikes were happening, I got so many phone calls from friends of mine that worked out there, saying, well, I can't write for TV or film right now. I think I'm going to write that book I've always wanted to write. And I've got a podcast that I do once a week called Writers Inc. And we talk to new authors, big name authors. We've noticed a huge influx lately of screenwriters that wrote books, 2 years ago, when those strikes were going on. Now all those books are starting to come out. So like everybody's always, it's a very incestuous industry. The book people are always looking at film and TV people are always looking at books. Everybody wants to do what the other person is doing. For me personally, I like writing the book. I know if I write a good story, I know I can sell that. I know it's going to go somewhere. If you write a screenplay, if nobody likes it or it doesn't get picked up, it goes in a drawer, and it gets forgotten. So that's a difficult world. And I've tried doing it. I've got a book called A Caller's Game. Ridley Scott's company picked it up. And they asked me to write the screenplay for it. And I sat down and I wrote the screenplay, and my movie was 4.5 hours long. The reason being is like when I write a book, like I trim out all the excess stuff. Like when I write that book, like I'll usually write like 160,000 words, and then I'll cut like 40,000 words out of that before it becomes a finished product. So I basically, in my mind, I've taken out everything that could come out. So that so if they tell me to then take that and turn it into a movie, I've got nothing I can remove or that I personally feel can come out. So I am just not the guy for it. Like, the funny thing is though, like
here, guys, so there's no way I'm cutting anything, right?
Yeah. But, like the world is changing so fast. Like when I first did that, a 4.5 hour movie, that's obviously not going to work. But now streaming has gotten to the point where they're circling back and they're like, well, we could put that on Netflix as a 2 or 3 parter. Like they've got that kind of flexibility now. So everything, even if it goes in a drawer, it may get life, again later.
Oh, nice. I can't wait to hear this. So, all right. So, your work spans thrillers, horror, crime, suspense. How do you approach writing differently on the genre, or is your approach always the same? When you're in the Barkerverse.
Well, I try to keep the general theme of suspense in every one of my books. So even if I write a thriller, it's a suspense thriller. I may include elements of horror, but it's still this. Like I try to keep that core thing there, which is mainly for the readers, because I want readers to pick up a book and it needs to feel familiar to them. Even if I go off in left field, I bring in some sci-fi or something else, it needs to feel like home. So I try to keep that, I'm conscious of that. From the get-go, though, I knew I was going to do this. I've been in the industry working behind the scenes for about 20, 30 years almost before I put out that first book. And I've had so many friends that had like a book that hit really well. And all of a sudden they have to write that same book, but different over and over and over again, because the publishing house wants, something similar every single time. That scared me to death. I didn't want to get stuck writing that same thing. If you're a musician, imagine having to, write the same song over and over, but change it just enough, like that gets old.
Listen,
so I purposely,
for Christmas, you know the song "I Wish You Merry Christmas" Jose Feliciano.
Yeah,
he was so sick of it during last Christmas that he remixed it in a very vulgar way that everybody was shocked. So yeah, I get it when you mean like, yeah, could you imagine? He got so sick. He goes, "I'm changing the lyrics now," and everybody got so like, oh, that's him.
Musicians fascinate me. One of my first jobs in college, I worked for RCA Records, and I've hung around with a lot of famous musicians. And, like to see them get up on stage night after night, sometimes for 10, 20, 30 years and play that same song that made them famous and play it as if it's the greatest song ever. And they want to be there playing it. Like that is a special skill, because, they put that guitar and microphone down, go backstage and go, I never want to hear that effing thing again.
I can't imagine that for real. So the way you write, man, you do some you like to dive deep into psychological fears. I mean, where do you find those inspirations for your most terrifying ideas? Did you go back to that day when you picked up Dracula as a child and was scared?
That's part of it. My next book coming out, it's called Something I Keep Upstairs. It's about a haunted house. So where this came about is I live on a little island off the coast of Portsmouth in New England. And I go for a run every day when I finish up my work. I do a lap around the island. It's a little over 4 miles. And at one point I cross the beach. And if I stand out on the beach, there's another island off the coast of our island. It's only about an acre. And the only thing sitting on it is a tiny little white house with a red roof. And just, it's about a 1/4 mile out. So it's just far enough where you can see it, but you can't really tell what's going on out there. Yeah. Every once in a while I'd see somebody walking on the beach. Sometimes you see a light on, but you don't really know what's happening. As an author, there's 2 very important words to me. What if? So I see something like that and I start thinking, what if? So in this story, what if that house belongs to somebody's grandmother? That grandmother passes away and leaves the house and the island to her 17-year-old grandson. That's the basis of this story. That's how I started off. This kid gets pulled out of his class in school and is told his grandmother just passed away and he just inherited this house. And he does exactly what every other 17-year-old would do with a house on an island. He turns it into a party house for him and his friends. Of course they're going to do that. It's someplace they can get away from the parents. The parents can't even sneak up on them. It's on an island. You can see boats coming for, 1/4 mile around. But even partying out there gets old. And after a while, somebody sits down and said, hey, what would it take to make this a haunted house? And the tagline for the book is, for a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die. So you know where they're going, but they don't necessarily start there. But that's how we set the premise. But it all started with a real house, that is literally like I can see it outside my window if I go outside. Now, when I finish up the book, I have to sell this book. So I have to put my marketing hat on. So I struck a deal with the people that actually own the property, and we're giving away an overnight stay in the haunted house.
Oh,
So
cool.
we're going to draw a name, and that person is going to get to take 3 of their friends. We're going to put them in a boat. We're going to take them out to the island. We're going to drop them off on the beach, and we're not coming back for them for 24 hours. They're going to spend the night in a haunted house. And this is a place that
you, bro. I can't swim. If I want to get off, I'm really stuck. You're gonna find me dead laying on the beach.
that island is surrounded by great white sharks. You do not want to be in the water if you don't have to be.
I can't
but that's one of those things, though. From a marketing standpoint, like I can buy advertisements all day long, but what really sells books is word of mouth. And the idea of being able to stay overnight in a haunted house, from a book, like people are talking about it, and that's what moves copies.
So can people get that info right there on your official website, jdbarker.com, or where can they get that type of info?
They can find it there. I'll go ahead and send you the link so you can put it in your show notes if you want to go ahead and do that.
Heck yeah, I definitely want to do that. I want people to get involved. That sounds amazing. Now, I love how you were talking earlier about indie and traditional publishing, having the experience in both. What do you think are the biggest advantages and disadvantages of indie versus traditional?
Well, I think I'm thrilled that I got to try being an indie at the beginning, because that gave me that little taste, and I had something to compare to. If I had to draw an analogy, I would probably say it's very similar. Like if you think of a harbor, you've got a cruise ship sitting in that harbor. If they want to make that boat make a left-hand turn or turn it around, that's going to take some time. It's going to take some effort. That's basically your traditional publisher. An indie author is like a speedboat. They can zip in and around that ship. They can do whatever they want. They come up with, as an indie author, if you come up with an idea, like if you were to tell me an idea right now that I thought made sense, I could implement that 10 minutes after we hang up, from this call. Indie authors can move that fast. It doesn't happen in the traditional world. So when I started publishing books on the traditional side, I brought a lot of that indie experience with me, things that I had learned in the trenches as an indie author. We started doing on my traditionally published books, and they had never done that before.
Gotcha. Now, I want to go back to something too, because back in your early days, when you were getting into writing one night, you had an interesting opportunity with someone that wound up being kind of famous. You would say, an individual named Paul.
Paul Galata.
Yeah, man.
Is that what you're talking about? Yeah. So. So writing is one of those things, like I was always good at it, mainly because I read a lot, like I read so much, like the story structure and everything just got ingrained in my head. I've never had any formal training. But in school, like I was always good at English class. If they gave me an assignment, I could hammer that out, without putting a whole lot of, time or effort into it. But I was in college, and this is really going to date me, but the Berlin Wall had just come down. And this was, I think, 1989. Yeah. A bunch of rock bands decided to get together, and they were going to fly to Moscow and put on a concert. And this had never been done before, so I wrote a paper for my English class about this particular trip. And it was Bon Jovi, Skid Row, a bunch of hair bands from the day, and turned it in for an English assignment. Didn't think anything was going to really come of it, but I ended up getting a phone call from a guy named Paul Galata, who was the editor of Circus magazine. My English teacher liked the paper enough where she had sent it off to him. Wow. And he liked the paper enough where he offered me a job. And initially I was going to write for Circus, when I was in college, but then he told me that he was starting a brand new magazine down in South Florida, which is where I was, called 25th Parallel, and asked if I'd like to be part of that. So that's what I ultimately ended up doing. One of the other guys that he hired was a guy named Brian Warner, who later became Marilyn Manson. So we had a pretty eclectic crew down there.
Crazy stuff. Crazy story. What a mix. And I love that, how that, and also the way you navigate the indie scene and grow from that to doing what you're doing now is absolutely insane. Now, everybody wants to know this. Again, there's a lot of writers out there. What does a typical writing day look like for you? Any rituals or habits that you do to keep you productive?
Well, back when I was in the corporate world, I was working 60 to 80 hours a week, but I would still find some way to, to knock out 200 to 300 words a day, no matter what. 200 to 300 words a day, that's a novel in a year. So I think that's doable for pretty much anybody. I think writing is very much like going to the gym. You need to do it, very regularly, build that writer muscle, or it just gets weak. So I think you really do need to write every day. To make that happen, I had a couple little tricks that I used to do. I'd listen to a thunderstorm soundtrack on noise canceling headphones whenever it was time to write. It was a very Pavlov's dog kind of thing. As soon as I heard that noise, my brain immediately knew it's time to write. So I would just start going. And I never got up. I always left my desk mid-sentence, so like I would write, I gave my words and like I would end like mid-sentence. I already knew what was coming next.
Okay.
And by doing that, my brain continued to work that story. So the next time I sat down, I hit the ground running. I never stare at a blank screen. I tried to write in the same place every day because, again, it kind of tricks your mind into thinking, okay, this is what we do when we're sitting in this particular chair. Those kind of things helped me get it done when I was, still working at, the day job. Today's world is very different. I get up at the crack of 7 in the morning. I told myself when I left the corporate world, I'd never set an alarm before 7. Wander down to the kitchen. I grab my cup of coffee, head to my desk, and immediately start writing. I turn the internet off first thing in the morning. I don't turn it on until I get my word count for the day. I try to write like 2,000 to 3,000 words. Usually have that by about 10:30 or 11. Then I flip the switch on the internet and my inbox gets filled with basically the business side of this, dealing with agents, with editors, the publishing stuff, interviews, things like this. All that kind of stuff happens in the afternoon. I wrap up my day at 3 o'clock and I go for that run that I mentioned. Then when I get home, I spend the rest of the night with my daughter and my wife.
Nice. What an amazing ritual, folks. You see that? Time for family, time for self, and time for your craft. Wonderful breakdown. I really like that. Now, I got 2 more questions before we go. All right. So this is about aspiring authors' pitfalls, if you will. Right. So what's the biggest mistake that you see new writers make, and how can they maybe avoid them?
I think the biggest mistake I see happen, especially in today's world, people will write a book, they send it off to agents and they get rejected and rejected and rejected. Then they decide, well, I'll just self-publish it just to get it out there. That's probably the worst mistake you can actually make. What you really, because what ends up happening if you do that, you hit the publish button on Amazon, the book gets out there in the wild, your friends and family read it, they give it a 5-star review, so you get 10 or 25-star reviews. Then all of a sudden a real reader stumbles into it and they start pointing out all the flaws. Like this got formatting errors, it's got developmental errors, it's got this, it's got that, and you start getting these 2 and 3-star reviews. And before you know it, the book is dead. It's not selling. Nobody's going to buy it because it's got a low rating, so it just kind of fizzles and dies. What you really need to do is look at those rejections, try to talk to those agents, find out why they're turning the book down. And if you can get them to tell you, see if it's something that you can fix, tweak the book, get it better, and then take it back out again and try to make it happen. If you get a book that, let's say, Random House wants, that's the one you should probably indie publish. You don't necessarily have to give it to a big publisher, but it needs to be quality wise. It needs to be on par with something they're willing to put out.
Excellent. And thank you. Great advice there. And folks, I want you to talk about these real quickly before I get into my last question, right? Yeah, I have a nice lineup of books over here. The Sixth Wicked Child, The Fifth to Die, The Fourth Monk, Dracu, which is an interesting story on that. Like, I can't believe they contact you for a prequel opportunity. I mean, I'm stoked about that myself, because I'm a big Dracula fan. And then you got Forsaken, wonderful books. I mean, James Patterson showing that love. And folks, you got to pick these books up, because I've been showing you guys the link. These are available by your favorite bookstores and whatnot. Website. I mean, follow my man on X at JD Barker. I mean, dope books, man. What a wonderful one. Now, as we see these books right here, right? This is my question, Jay. This is what I got to ask you here. If you had to survive inside one of your own novels, which book will you choose and why? And more importantly, how long do you think it'd last?
That's a tough question, because all these people and places are very real to me. I would probably have to go with Dracul, which is the prequel to Dracula, just because it was so much fun to write, and it just existing in that world in Victorian England. Was in Ireland and stuff. It was fun. It got to be very surreal, because when the book came out, we went on our book tour and we stopped in Dublin, which is where a lot of the Dracul actually takes place. And I had never been there before, so like I knew Dublin through Bram Stoker's eyes and through his notes. So the way he described the city is how I pictured it. So when I was there in real life, I would see a church that Bram talked about, or I would see this building that Bram talked about, but right next to it would be a McDonald's, or a bank or something. It's like the old world mixing with the new world. Yeah. But it felt at the time very much like I was actually following in his footsteps. I was literally walking on the same sidewalks that he had walked. So in a lot of ways, I got to do that. I didn't get chased by the vampire, which is probably a good thing.
No, but I dig it. You told me, one of the first books, that book you found for a quarter being Dracula. And then, here later in life, the family themselves approach you with an opportunity, from what I understand. Like, how did you even feel about this? I mean, what
that was
in life?
that was a crazy opportunity. Obviously not something you say no to. So Dacre Stoker, who's Bram's great grandnephew, he approached me at the Horror Writers Convention, and Forsaken was up for the best debut novel that year. So we were both there. And he pulled me aside and said, the family's been trying to find somebody to write a prequel to Dracula for a very long time. We've all read your book. We love your writing style. We know your history. Is this something you'd be interested in doing? They said they were going to give me access to all of Bram Stoker's notes, his journals, literally everything he had on his desk when he wrote the original book. There was just no way I would say no to that, because it was such an iconic book, but also, it played such an important role in my life. Like, I wouldn't be writing today without that particular book. Like, that's the one that made me want to do this for a living. So, being part of that world, even for just a little while, was worthwhile.
Man, and now, can you tell us a bit about the book? Is there anything, new stories? Did you take any liberties in that world building, or how are you able to touch, the OG paperwork and notes? I mean, that must have been a wild ass experience.
Yeah. So, when Bram first wrote Dracula, he actually tried to sell it as a true story. Like, he completely believed he believed vampires were real. We found notes where he started researching vampires as young as 16 years old. And he didn't write Dracula until he was 43. So this was a lifelong project for him.
Oh, wow.
And when he died, he had himself cremated at a time in history when people didn't do that, because he was worried that, vampires would come for his immortal soul. Like, this guy bought it hook, line, and sinker. But he took the book to his publisher. His publisher read it and pushed it right back across the desk and said, there's no way we can put this out. It'll scare the hell out of people. And at the time, Jack the Ripper was active in London. People believed in the paranormal. So, like, putting out a book that basically presented vampires as real, they weren't willing to do it. So they made him strip out the first 100 pages of the book. So Dracula, as we know it, starts with Jonathan Harker on a train. That's actually page 102 of Bram's original manuscript. So the story that Dacre and I set out to tell is what Bram originally wanted to tell. Those first 100 pages, why he felt vampires were real. And it's very autobiographical. He explains from early childhood until he became an adult, all of his experiences, and explains why vampires are real. And the thing is, when you finish that book, you read the author's note that we left at the end, and the parts that you feel are fiction are actually true. And we back it up with photos and other things. And like the scariest parts in the book are based on Bram's real experiences. And that to me was, like those selling points, being a part of that, that was all something I wouldn't pass up ever.
I dig it. Man, thank you so much. And what's the latest book people need to be looking for that's out on the shelves right now?
I've got two coming out. Well, I've got a lot of books coming out. So I've got one coming out with, I've got one with James Patterson called The Writer, coming out in March. That one's a lot of fun. It's probably my favorite book we've written together so far. And then my next solo title is the one we were talking about the haunted house. It's called Something I Keep Upstairs. That one releases May 13th, and you definitely don't want to miss that one.
Oh, you hear this? And again, folks, you want to stay tuned. This is where you find JD. You go to his official website at jdbarker.com. Okay, his books are available on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, and all major bookstores, baby. And of course, you can follow my homie on X at JD Barker. Oh, listen, it's everything in the show notes. Make it easier. Please don't forget to send over that link for that house stay. And this is the last thing before you go, because you mentioned, I'm not going to forget, that you do a podcast. Let them know when they could tune into that podcast. How often do you drop it?
Sure. That one's called Writers Inc. INK for Inc. We put a new episode out every Tuesday.
There we go. So stay tuned every Tuesday, baby, which is today. Hey, so go over and run over to his channel and see what he got popping off over there. JD, thank you again for your time. To all my Crusaders that were tuning in, much love. I appreciate you. Stay tuned, because we Comic Crusaders got a whole lot more coming up, baby. Thank you, JD. Later, Crusaders. Huepa! Thank you for listening to the Comic Crusaders podcast. If you like the content, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Also, please visit comiccrusaders.com and our extended podcast family over at undercovercapes.com. And also, make sure to download the Comic Crusaders app on the Google Play Store today.